Reading an article by Miller and an article by Renix and Robinson, and I often have students who get really hung up on small details in these, but I think the important part is the broad questions they're asking us to think about. And I'll begin today with Miller's article by saying Miller's article talks about a variation on the trolley problem called the tunnel problem, which has taken on a particular emphasis and importance in the discussion of artificial intelligence used for self-driving cars. And the tunnel problem actually has a very fundamental difference from the trolley problem, in that while there is similarities between the situation that the model is meant to convey, the actual question, the way of thinking, and what is important are very different. The tunnel problem suggests that we could learn something about ethics, morals, or values by saying, imagine your car is going along, there's a tunnel ahead. If you keep going straight, you will survive. If you don't keep going straight, you will go off a cliff or ram into the wall of the cliff. There is no other option. As you're approaching the tunnel, a child runs out ahead. And you have the choice of survival or killing. And this is posited as a suggestion for us to consider where ethical values are in making decisions happen in self-driving cars. And throughout the article, he actually presents a number of different considerations. He draws on Lynn, who is talking about the actual self-driving cars, who suggests this is really a binary question, and we worry about it. Who is the one who you're going to prioritize? He talks about Williams, who says this is unfortunately a complex interplay where preference utilitarianism is going to come into play. Some people are going to argue that self-protection is better. Some people are going to argue that protecting the child is better. Complex forms of utilitarianism are unlikely because we don't like to put the price on one person in a measurable, comparable way, but it could happen. And so the shift might be that rather than trying to think of a universal answer, we're just going to end up saying the preference would have to go with the individual. And that means that you'll have a switch in your car for your self-driving car. And believe it or not, this is not science fiction weird. We already, in fact, know that this is the way that they're thinking about it in automatic self-driving car forms, because a couple of years ago, when some of the first driver assist automations were being put into Mercedes actually posted ads saying, our self-driving car functions always keep you alive. They don't care about other people, and if the choice is, for example, automatic braking, if somebody brakes in front of you is the example that's actually on the road right now. If somebody brakes in front of you, our car automatically brakes, and it doesn't pay attention if there's somebody behind you, right? That's somebody else's worry. Your airbags will keep you alive if somebody hits you from behind. And their argument was that this wasn't, as Miller would suggest, something you have to leave up to the end user. The argument for many designers is, as we talked about last time, the answer is to be determined. The place for preference utilitarianism, for variations in values, is the market, right? Mercedes declares, if you want this answer to this simple question, buy our product. And in fact, at the time that those ads from Mercedes came out, I forget if it was Audi or Volkswagen, somebody else was also putting a number of varieties of driver assist automations in the car and said theirs were more complicated. They attempted to look at the whole circumstance, and they tried to balance risks to pedestrians. Now, all of these fights, when it comes to available consumer technologies, in some ways, they're difficult to jump into because they're already made. They're decisions that have been produced. Whereas the ongoing fights about fully self-driving cars, such as the Google self-driving car, those are still more available for discussion because they haven't been made, right? And so the discussion in Miller is really much more about how we can consider those self-driving cars in the future that will be fully making the decision. And this tunnel problem is used as a very specific example, not to say that this is an easy question, but to literally say the whole way we have these conversations is kind of wrong, right? Because if you compare these discussions by experts, by Lynn, by Williams, he says, why don't we ever compare this to informed consent in medicine, right? In informed consent in medicine, the responsibility is divided. We actually consider where and how to make a decision, right? It's not just the end user gets to do it. It's the end user gets to do it, but they actually are required to understand the issues involved, right? And that means we design the system to allow an educated decision. And he says this is a level of complexity that we often forget in thinking about these problems, and it's a level of complexity that's totally missing in the tunnel problem, right? Because, for instance, if you are designing this car, it sees a tunnel up ahead, it sees a narrowing. Why didn't it slow down beforehand, right? Why isn't it moderating for unexpected risks? And if we don't want it to do that, then why aren't we allowing the person traveling in the car to make the decision, right? There's easy enough to have a little button that says, oh no, kill me. I don't want to kill a child, right? Why don't we use informed consent? And Miller doesn't answer that question. And that's actually a very different approach to how we should add complexity to this set of questions than Rennick and Robinson, whose focus is very different, right? They're talking about, so this week, the trolley problem, which is a classic thought experiment in ethics, and that as a thought experiment, it's meant to convey something specific. So the trolley problem, which is often cited to Philippa Foot, is actually not, it doesn't originate there. This, as an example of an ethical conflict moment, goes back to a moment in the 1870s and 80s when early trolleys were actually on the streets with what was referred to as open switching, right? So that little picture that I have there in the document of you standing next to a lever sounds ridiculous to people. In fact, by 1967, it was considered a ridiculous example because nobody used open switching anymore. In the 1870s, 1880s, as late as the 1930s, the systems of streetcars were often designed with open switching because it meant that the whole system was able to move faster. You could have one guy, if you needed to change routes, one guy, literally an employee of the trolley system, would jog along the system, changing those switches to match. You didn't want to slow that person jogging down, so you left the switches open. And that did mean that there were crashes because somebody had pulled a lever or changed it along the way. Now, the absurdity of this whole scenario is really clear. If you haven't watched it, I recommend. Often in the last year, last couple of semesters when I've taught this class, we've talked about the trolley problem. People have already seen or have looked up the trolley problem and seen the Good Place episode. And I think in some ways, the ridiculousness, the absolute stupidity of this as an ethical, teachable thing is really clear in that. Except we have to go back to what Philippa Foot and other philosophers were doing with it. This is not meant to teach you ethics. It is only meant to teach the difference between deontological and consequentialist decision making. Right? So it is a simplified decision used to teach the model that distinguishes causes as the important thing or rules as the important thing, duties. And so in this article, Rennick and Robinson are like, the real problem here isn't the trolley problem. It's that we keep teaching people the trolley problem, right? People get taught this mental model, which suggests that there are choices that are A or B. They're binary decision making. And that the moment we switch to binary decision making in these things, we're ignoring everything else, right? So even when Miller says we should potentially have a button in the car, why isn't there a safety guard to keep a kid from running into the road? Why is the kid in the road in the first place? Where did the kid come from? Why is the tunnel so narrow? Why didn't we build a wider road? Miller never asks any of these questions. He doesn't even get into the question of why we'd want self-driving cars in the first place. And one of the ironies is that a significant argument for self-driving cars is that they would provide safer roadways. So if the argument for self-driving cars as a socially acceptable technology is that they will be safer for everybody, then this tunnel problem is completely misleading, because it's arguing that we should still have a choice between social safety and individual safety. And in reality, if the argument for legally allowing self-driving cars is that they will be safer for others as well as ourselves, then we've already had that. Miller is arguing for adding a level of complexity that's not a big enough level of complexity. Now, Renix and Robinson, on the other hand, argue that we actually are being taught these bad binary choices by use of these things, right? They teach us a way of thinking about things while also sort of denying or hiding, or at very least not acknowledging, that there are these other axioms and assumptions which they require. So the trolley problem, which says you're standing at the side of the road, you know how in the position you can choose which is the right action: to pull the lever, in which case it will kill one person, that's a direct action on your part, or to stand there in horror and not do anything and let the trolley hit 5 people. And one of the things they talk about in the Renix and Robinson article is that often in this case, in order to try and drive home these things, we do bigger and fancier versions of the trolley problem. You have the medical planet that, you can, you read it, you know what I mean. Or you go, it's 5 nuns versus 1 criminal. You try and modify it to change. And again, we're looking at this as if this binary question of, is it better to have fewer deaths or for you to commit an action, was an actual moral question. And it's not, right? It is purely there to try and get you to recognize the difference between a deontological ethic. I should not kill. If I should not kill is the operating term, if you are deontologically bound to not kill, you cannot pull the lever and save the 5 people by killing the other person. If the operating ethical system is consequentialist, you must kill the 1 person because it is a significantly less bad outcome. And since we're measuring the ethical nature of your action, your decision, by that action's outcome, you have no choice what to do. And while it is potentially a good example of what the differences are between deontological and consequentialism, it actually is a terrible way to Yeah, I mean, I will in fact say there is an intended expansion off of the discussion last week, Edwin, where last week a lot of what we talked about is that in design and engineering, you're taught to think in terms of mental models that are narrowing, right? Don't worry about that. The market will figure it out. Don't worry about environment because your question is how to perform in this narrow form. Don't worry about complex models of efficiency, including life cycle of the product. Just think in terms of this one measure that is what we're focusing on, right? So a lot of what we talked about last week is very much a question of which mental models you have access to, which ones you rely on. This issue of some mental models are intended to teach simplifications is very much what we're taking from last week into this week. Yeah, you're right. And so the thing that Renix and Robinson are talking about is Right. One of them is trained as an engineer, but is a policy person. And the other one is trained as a civil engineer and has worked managing the public transportation system in New Orleans, I think. They may be in a different city, but they're like, you literally, like, if you're in this professional situation where you're having discussion of how to make decisions and you go back to the mental models that the trolley problem tells you, you failed, right? Like, because no one should be blamed for standing on that street corner and pulling the lever, right? Like, we know 100 years later that the problem here was open switching on the thing and lack of traffic signals and failure to train people not to walk in the tracks when a train's coming, right? There are all sorts of things going on here which are decisions and complexities outside of a binary choice. And what happens when you keep teaching people binary choices is that they end up looking at things as binary choices, right? You're not teaching people to pay attention to structure and systems. You're teaching them to just pick one pair of options. And instead of doing that, their argument is we should potentially reconsider the model of choice that we're using to teach these ethical debates. And so this initial division in the trolley problem between an active choice, right? Why on earth would you accept the premise in the trolley problem that it is different to pull the lever or not pull the lever, right? The reality is that an active choice and an inactive choice are equally choices, but the trolley problem fails to participate in that question, right? The trolley problem assumes that it's ethically neutral to not pull the lever from a deontological standpoint, and that's ridiculous, right? It also assumes that there is 100% responsibility to the person at the lever, right? It is absolute responsibility and not partial responsibility. What would happen if we thought about this with proportional responsibility, right? If the responsibility for this moment is the train driver who should see people in front of him, the people walking on the track, the person who designed the system, the person who's not keeping people off the track, the police officers should be watching that corner because they know it's dangerous. Everybody bears a component of proportional responsibility. And thinking about it in that way literally changes what options and considerations go into this, right? The other thing that it does is it focuses on the incident as the scale of ethical thinking, right? We're not talking about the way of doing why things happen. We're either learning to think of incident-based ethics, right? In this particular moment, or what are the chain, I like this phrase from Rennickson Robinson, what is the chain of decision-making that is involved here? Because if we really want to talk about the ethics of it, we need to know the sequence of decisions that lead up to this, that are involved, the alternatives that could have been available, the potential possibilities. What ways could it be changed, right? If we know, for example, that letting 5 people die means that they're going to fix the system tomorrow, it prevents more deaths in the long run. It is not only those past decisions or the current decision, it's also future decisions that are lined up. And it may be a very terrible thing to suggest, let more people die because then somebody will fix the problem because it got bad enough. Although historically it turns out that there are consequentialist models that would suggest that is a good way of thinking about it. At the core of Rennickson Robinson's question is, why is it we look at the problem and find our focus where it is, right? How do we end up focused on the elements that we are? And if our attention to what factors structure the individual choices is absent, right? What makes one option available or not option available in the experiment, in the analogy, in the evaluation, then we're not paying attention because much like we said last week about agency, you can look at the concept of power. How does one do or do not have the possibility of producing an outcome? That's power. right? And that's what simplified absolute thing is. Or you look at what factors connect it, right? Does it matter in this case if the people that are on the track are valuable people or poor people or rich people or nuns or orphans, if they're, illegal aliens? To some people, those things do matter. And all of that is erased by saying one simplified version. These are your two options, right? So for instance, I use a terrible example here often when we're talking about this, where I say, look, if the person working on the rail ahead of us, if we assume that those 5 people are subway repair people working on the trolley who know that there is a risk, who've chosen to be on the track, and the other person that you would kill by saving those 5 people is a school kid walking to school, minding their own business, who's not jaywalking. They're walking with the light. They're doing everything appropriate to make themselves safe. Like, it changes the situation. But if we think of it only in terms of a narrowest possible pair of binary options, we ignore all of the factors that contribute to what makes things possible. And so Rennick and Robbins say factors that structure the individual choices as, I say, conditions as opposed to the nature of those choices, right? What is there going on? Don't think of this as 2 options and we have to talk about those 2 options. Why are those the only options? How and who should have power is important. Miller brings that up, right? Who gets to make the decision? But how and who actually made those effects happen, right? If we're talking about automated cars, only some people in your society are going to have enough money for automated cars, right? There's never going to be these perfect moments, right? If you're going to talk about automated cars, well, one of the things we can talk about is how do we want to readjust or modify the infrastructure of roadways to make modified cars, different cars, the right kind of car. We could have a whole lot of discussions around those. What complexity and what other questions or choices are not mapped on within those thought experiments? And so we get this really interesting different kinds of decisions where the trolley problem most frequently is A or B. And then you have Miller, who says, well, let's take a minute and say, is that the right way? Where should that decision be made? And it's possible for Miller that we want to have 2 different decisions that affect it, right? We could say, let's change from being A or B there to being A or B here. And that sort of sequential model, right, where we add in other questions because there are more things, is how Miller is arguing, right? Instead of isolating the binary, we're going to have a non-isolated binary.
So around this discussion of mental models, I wanted to focus a little bit of specific attention on the hegemonic or dominant model. And last time we talked about the idea of hegemonic or dominant design, that there is a specific, unquestioned way in which a person in engineering, in the case of hegemonic and dominant design, or a general system in which a belief or a set of beliefs or a way of thinking is normalized, is thought of as being unquestionable, and by extension is thought to be universal without exceptions. And one of the places where that occurs, where there is an unquestioned universalized, hegemonic, that is expected, and you're thought of potentially as strange, or you might suffer some negative effect if you start breaking off of it. Um, One of the things that's really interesting about this is that it doesn't actually have a negative effect if you change how you think about choice. It often is potentially good to do so. It opens up new possibilities. But the way we tend to think about choice is what I call sovereign choice. And I'll mention again, sovereign refers to a king. It refers to the person with absolutely nobody telling them what to do. And the idea of an absolute and individual choice um, has a particular pressure to it because we see a choice as being ours and not context, not situational. We tend to assume that limitations or context effects or anything that changes from us having free will, absolute and individual choice, to being in connection to other people can often seem like it's taking something away from us. And so once you've been convinced of the idea of choice, for instance, it's hard to accept responsibility for something when you don't expect that you really had that much control. And um, we know that we're responsible. We're the ones doing the choosing. And so it's actually really important that we move away from that for a couple of reasons, because most of the time our decisions are being made in complex ways. We're affected, we're enabled, we're constrained, and we are seeing the world in reference to and connecting to other choices, past and future. Today, we'll be talking about shadow choices and unmade choices and Hobson's choices, and trying to build up the idea that not every choice is a sovereign choice by recognizing that there are other kinds. And we as individuals are not making sovereign choices. In almost any situation, we're neither a king or a dictator. We aren't acting without connections to other things. But even in the case of a king, even in the case of a dictator or somebody with absolute power, their decisions and choices are still going to affect other ones. You bought something today, you therefore don't have to buy it tomorrow. You didn't buy it today, you still have that choice tomorrow. Choices are not individual and isolated. And this is really a central element in how Renix and Robinson want us to think about things, that choices end up in sort of a networked, mapped out, complex mode where if we want to have a real conversation about what's going on in a circumstance, even if we're focusing on one choice, we still need to maintain reference and connection to other choices. There's no value to the thought experiment of the trolley problem if its focus on that single choice between limited options is all there is. It doesn't tell you anything. And while it can be useful to have a discussion of the specific differences in philosophy, it won't actually tell you a reasonable lesson. And if we get used to thinking about ethics in those ways, then we tend to no longer use it just as a teaching tool. We tend to think about the trolley problem or question and mental models like that form so that we use them in other circumstances. Now, I mention options because one of the reasons that we want to be careful about that is the more we focus on the act of choosing, the more we think of choice as this moment of action, which is often, in fact, encouraged in ethical theory as opposed to in sociology and psychology and economics even, where actions are part of ongoing processes. In ethical theory, because there are these mental models that focus on one specific moment of decision as an action, disconnected from other things, we tend to look at it that way. And this just isn't the way the world works. When we talk about decisions or choice, we have to recognize that there are always connections, links that allow for some options to be available, some to be invisible, some to be more difficult, some options we would never see. And that's why the decision-making process has to be something we work on, because at very least, by thinking about how we're making the decision, by working through those issues, we're then able to give ourselves more options. And the sovereign choice model is particularly bad for this. Because the sovereign choice is isolated and individual, it tends to mean that, among other things, you can't ask for help. You can't inquire. You can't even use expert or carefully researched perspectives. You have to sort of turn it into flipping a switch moment. And that means that, for instance, in the sovereign choice, there's a strong urgency, what we will talk about later in the semester as exigency. There's a demand to be a chooser, as opposed to a demand to actually research and perform well in the larger context. And this potentially offers very different effects in different ethical moments. There may be a moment where the long-term consequences do matter or don't matter. There are ways that your connection to other people, your professional role, etc., all of which are affected by the emphasis on that one momentary action. And so the more we think of any choice as being, let's ask which choices, which options are available, why are those available, what produces that moment of selection. As all of that becomes part of the mental model instead of sovereign choice, we move to what we can call a complex or a limitation or a structure aware version of the choice. And as a side note, this is actually one of the things that has characterized what are often called disruptive or disruptive innovations or disruptive technological developments, because one of the ways that you get those things is to see these limitations that have often been taken for granted. And those things are invisible unless you're working to recognize them. Recognize that limitations are not denying you the ability to choose, but limitations, context, complexity actually enables you to make better choices, is often the opposite of sticking with the hegemonic model.
Decision, every action is actually affected by all sorts of other actions, right? It is the product of actions that came before it. It is one of possible decisions that are appearing. It is affecting and changing a whole sequence of decisions that will come after it. And in many cases, the relationship between all of these decisions is absolutely imperative, right? So because we move from there to here, right, instead of going to another decision, that makes a difference, because this and this are also influencing it, because this is going on over here, that's influencing it, because of that. The complex negotiation that goes on means that this produces other ongoing effects. And so instead of, as we move through this model, where we say basically we go from one decision to the next, that's it. Is it a good or a bad decision? We're actually going to get very different answers, right? This is not just saying that the process is complicated. It is saying that we literally get different answers. What is ethical? And this is absolutely true. Among many reasons to think this is because the question of the isolation or the interaction, right, is really important. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? So what we're really seeing in these articles is an argument that if we learn how to think about ethical choices from the trolley problem, we're learning a different kind of thing than if we do something else. Thank you. And my own research, one of the things that I talk about is this idea of the choice models. And so we're going to take a minute to say, look, this simple versus linear question, right? This is important, right? So models are simple, linear, or complex branching. And those are just ways of talking about it. It's not that there's an actual moment in time where you go, oh no, I'm in a simple choice. These are ways of limiting or not limiting how you look at choices. And I like Miller's step where he says, look, we should at least have this question of where and how decisions go. But let's not jump to the conclusion that Miller leads to, that that is the only change that's needed. And when we're looking at the trolley problem or the tunnel problem, we're asked which switch setting or which decision in very narrow ways. And by asking in those ways, by thinking of ethics in those ways, we're pressured to think of the decision process or the choice or the ethical moment, a single act. Right? So, for instance, if you never speed, if you're driving nice and slowly, and you're being careful, and you're driving down that tunnel problem example, it changes it. All those past decisions about how to drive, right? If you know that you're driving next to a children's school and that kids regularly cross the road there, it changes things. If you know that there are other people around, or if it's the middle of the night, it changes things. And so I would really include a lot of what Renix and Robinson are talking about there as being fundamental to how and where these decisions get made. And it's often the case. I try and teach you to do these more complex versions in very specific ways. I tell you, even before we talk about deontological and consequentialist analysis, everybody is carrying around a complex ethical framework that includes more than one of these, right? The basic premise that is being taught in the trolley problem comes out of a philosophical and not real world question that says you have to be one or the other. And in reality, all of us are already walking through these much more complex branching decision-making processes. What we're lacking is a way to think about them. All right. Switch back to the other notes. And so I often say what we're really reading in those two, I mean, we're reading to get a sense of how technical decision making is being implemented and how ethics fits into that. But we're also really trying to see that the nature of how we learn to think about choice has an effect. And so binary decision making is often what we're taught to do. You're taught to do this in school. You're taught to do this by these thought experiments. You're taught to do binary decision making constantly throughout your life, but it's a bad way to make decisions. And it's one of the real challenges for you in doing more complex critical thinking is it's not A or B, right? It's almost never A or B. It's often, what is the possibility that we could do A sub 1, A sub 2, A sub 3, B sub 1, B sub 2, B sub 3. Oh, wait, I forgot about C, D, E, F, G. And all of that is dependent on previous decisions that I could have made differently. But let's think about those other decisions for tomorrow. So there's tomorrow A, tomorrow B, tomorrow C. And that as we move into thinking about decision making this way, it really does change not just how we do ethics, but how we do decision making in general. So binary decisions are something that push you to think about A or B as options. And they tend to use this model that says the experience and use of the mental model actually makes it harder to consider outside options. And this is the real critique in Renix and Robinson of the trolley problem, that if you want to play the game, you have to pick one of those two. And we would never tolerate that in a video game, right? Just having one or A or B is not enough. We would recognize that as being railroading or being pressure. But when it comes to ethical decision making, we don't have a comparison. It would be like playing your first game without any points of reference. So this is where I say you can, in fact, think about how choice works. And one moment to start this, one way to think about this is that most people, and this is culturally specific to a degree, because the sovereign choice model is less universally believed outside of Western European and American culture, and in minority cultures, some minority cultures in even Europe and the West. But sovereign choice literally says when we talk about choice, when we think about choice, we should think about a person as making that choice as individual and absolute. And that focus on choice as an action, right? They are making an action, they are choosing, is not linking them to the situation, the context, the limitations, the modifiers, the constraint, the enablement. And the term sovereign choice refers back to a political concept of sovereignty where a king had no influences. They either made the choice, they didn't make the choice. And that the idea of sovereign choice is, we can actually go back to the history of how people think about the idea of choice or decision making. And we can see that this was built up over time. So very few people believed in the sovereign choice model until around the 1870s. And so oddly, around the same time that people went, let's just put them open switching trolleys in those cities, people would not have talked about this way. But in the last 150 years, we've really moved to this being the background assumption. And you can see that playing out in the way we talk about legal responsibility and cultural and social responsibility, where, for instance, it is often a bad thing. People will see it as a weakness or a failing to acknowledge that there was influence on their decision making from other people. My favorite example of this is, in fact, very specific to the United States, where for somebody like an expert in science to be consulted often is seen as a failure, a weakness. And we get this in my favorite example of this, because I hate him, is Elon Musk, who every so often when somebody points out that much of the credit for his technical and business decisions is him taking credit for other people, he would rather be accused of cheating than acknowledge that he works with and takes advice from other people. When people talk about the fact that, for example, the underlying technology for PayPal that he often gets credit for having invented, when he's asked if he feels it's appropriate for him to get all the credit for it, he actually has kind of said before he would rather be seen as stealing it than as being one of a number of people who collaborated. Because we're aiming attention at sovereign choice, people feel like, or people are taught to feel, that if they have to acknowledge that there is these levels of complexity, that there's collaboration, that these ideas, technologies, etc., are being participated in by more than one person, it is a weakening of your position as the deciding person. That's the point that we're trying to get across. And another time we can certainly come back to the general broader ethics of him or other business entities. But do people understand what we're saying about sovereign choice and about the way it influences our, because you are acknowledging not being the right kind of decider, if you are collaborating, if you're influenced by other people, if you are not doing it all on your own, right? This means that you don't think about or acknowledge those complexities. Because the importance for us is that all of us are really taught to think about sovereign choice as the right way to do it. And this is particularly problematic because, for instance, when we actually think about it, when you're presented with it, everybody knows that you are who you are because of your teachers, because of your family. You are in the positions you are because there's societal pressures or societal privileges. And that one of the real challenges for us is society, people, structures, institutions. Some people can get away with sovereign choice, some people don't. So many people end up, because they're either making the choice on their own or they're not making a choice, they're then presented with a situation where they can't produce or conceive of agency, that is, the ability to act and produce outcomes within limitations, right, within context, within situation, unless they are making a free and absolute choice. And even aside from that general problem where sovereign choice tells us some things are choices, this is, I can make the choice, I have an action to do, it tends to direct our attention at the act of choosing and not at the chosen things, the options, or the available possibilities. And this leads us to a really ridiculous moment where a whole bunch of books came out talking about how choice was, in one way or another, a bad thing, right? The paradox of choice was one of them that talks about the fact that if you have too many options, then the act of choosing is painful. It's hard to make a decision. But at the same time, the paradox of choice is you always want a choice, even if you know that by adding more options, more choices, it becomes harder and harder to feel good about making those choices. We have what sometimes gets talked about directly in engineering and design as function creep, where you go, I want to make sure that everybody has lots of options in this thing, you can do lots of things. We can lead to significant problems where people don't know which button to push, because as the options available become greater, we get problems of choice. Or things like choice fatigue, where while psychological theory would tell us this is not a real thing, I think most of us can empathize with the experience of having been asked to make too many decisions, too many choices, at which point we just are tired of doing it. So how we think about choice is cultural. It is produced and it is something that we can, in fact, fix or change by thinking about choice differently. And I often, when we're in class, we'll have a discussion, we'll use these concepts to have a discussion next time. But I often use the example of, why did you go to college, right? Did you choose to go to college? And for most people, there are two answers that will come to mind, one or the other, right? You'll either answer why you went to college, and you'll say, I didn't have a choice. Or you went, I chose because X. And that's a pretty specific way of answering the question. You're not bringing in what other options you had. You're not really talking about, was your choice modified or influenced by something. And we can have a longer discussion with that specific example to talk about, like, what other choices did you select from? Like, some of you may have thought about the military or about a different profession that wouldn't require college. But for a lot of people, you're like, you chose, like, the act, you chose to go to college. You didn't have to. It wasn't like you were getting forced physically. Um, but you don't really know what the other options were. And one of the elements about the sovereign choice model is that is an incredibly common feature of choosing, right? That because you are presented with an A or B binary decision, you don't really think about why, if, or how you're choosing. And so the question about the college thing then becomes, let's actually diagram out on the board usually, where I say, let's think what elements in our society, what institutions, what structures, what systems, what technologies directed that choice, right? So for instance, a lot of people go, I had no choice because the only way to have a living wage, to get a decent job, to have a decent future is to go to college. At which point I point out, in fact, for many people, that's not true, right? The reality is it's actually probably easier to have a good, stable salary having gone into the skilled trades, being a plumber, an electrician, than it is if you went into engineering. Now, the highest possible salaries in those fields are unlikely to be as high, but it's actually a better bet for a good result. And so, one of those moments where I'm asking you to think about this is, remember that we're saying if ethics is about decision making, right, a decision is right either because it is dictated by a preconceived or pre-established foundational belief, or you're defining that decision or action as right because of the outcome. So, for instance, if going to college is right because you'll potentially have a better job, and you never considered what other non-college pathways provide a better job, you're probably failing in making that decision as well as you could. But you're failing making that decision as well as you could because we literally built systems, college advisor systems, the high school educational structure, are all built to send people to college in certain ways, not to provide a real decision. Does that make your decision to go to college less or more? Does it change how you think about your decision? That, for instance, almost every high school in America has somebody who will help you apply to college. And last I checked, only 2 high schools in New York and New Jersey, one in each, had somebody on staff who was prepared to help you find a job or a training or a paid apprenticeship program in the skilled trades. And I forget what it is in New Jersey, but there's one of the ones in New York. The one in New York that was official is that there is a guy whose job it is at Aviation High School to sit people down and go to college. It's a great idea. Or have you considered being an airplane mechanic? Here's a paperwork about how to get a paid apprenticeship. You'll get about $40,000 out of high school to go straight into work. Once you complete your 5 years of apprenticeship, you'll be jumping your salary to about $70,000, and you'll be eligible for the union full protections. Right? So about the same time that other people are getting out of their college program, you will be settling into your nice, good job fixing airplanes. Right? That guy's job is to do that, but most colleges don't work that way. And some of you will have the opportunity to go directly from an internship into a job here. Some of you will be recruited, but the majority of you will not have a clear, direct pathway from college into a job. So the initial premise, the problem that you were trying to solve by going to college, isn't as simple as it was presented. You were presented with a binary instead of a complex question. You should be scared, right? Decision making matters. And this is not your fault, right? I'm not saying you're responsible for this. Earlier I said we need to shift to thinking about proportional responsibility. I don't think you should drop out. The reality is that there's a real set of questions, but the part of the question I'm asking you to think about is this is literally a series of choices, right? We do not make choices in nothing. We aren't making choices out of it. You were pressured to make a certain kind of choice and to think about choices before. Now I'm asking you to actually think about those choices. Like there are a million logical fallacies that these are related to. One of my favorites, skipping one of these things, we'll move to the idea of shadow choices. There's what's called has anybody here ever heard of I was about to say the investment fallacy. It's the sunk cost fallacy. So the sunk cost fallacy is this. You're like, I have to repair my car because I've already spent $1,000 buying the car. And somebody else walks along and goes, you'd be better off spending $2,000 to buy a new car instead of that car than spending another $1,000. Because your busted ass car, even if you put another $1,000 into it, yes, it'll only be $2,000. But the reasoning there is that 2 years later, your busted ass car will still suck $2,000 now instead of $1,000 on that car. You'll have a better car. It'll last more than 2 years. The premise of the sunk cost fallacy is that we have a tendency to see it as bad decision making, and it's not bad decision making, to abandon prior investments. And I compare this often to the idea of what's called shadow choices. It's a term that comes out of management studies. And basically what a shadow choice is, it's when you don't think about something as still being a choice because of a choice you made in the past. And shadow choices are particularly important for us because in engineering, we tend to do this a lot. Right? Why is, for example, this the standard for whatever it is? Well, because somebody decided it was. Could we be better off with a different standard? Why would you ask? We have a standard, right? Somebody says they have the choice of what the specifications for a job are. Once they've set those specifications, you assume you don't have a choice. That's not true. Specifications can change constantly. And even if it's written on paper in a contract, it can still change. And so in some ways, shadow choices are the non-financial version of sunk cost, right? Instead of saying, I already spent some money, I have to keep spending money in this way, this is the way of saying, for instance, Jesus, I do not encourage you to drop out of college, especially at the second and third year. You've already spent enough time here that investment is worth following through. But more importantly, the reason you go to college shouldn't just be because it's the easiest way to have a decent job. You should be doing it for learning. You should be doing it because in the grand liberal arts tradition, you will be able to actually function in society better for having learned these things. Right? If you're going to college and you're not spending any time, thought, or attention on things other than a couple of engineering classes and you're doing the minimum amount of effort to try and get through to become an engineer, I know. But the nature of your decision making is often pretty straightforward in that way, right? You go, I went to college, so I have to finish college. I don't really have a choice. And I actually often joke with my intro to STS class that, right, they're taking the class most of the time in the first year. Most of my students are first semester, first year, and I say, this is exactly the time to realize something about engineering. The average engineer does not make machines. They don't break them down. They don't play with them. You get mechanics to do that shit for you. You get technicians. Like if you want to weld things. I don't know that the decision to join the military is easy or should be. And I don't know one single pair of decisions where if you get to go, just do the military route, that's a nice simple decision. Just do college, that's a nice simple decision. There are no simple decisions like that, right? There may be a mental model. There may be one of these ways you've been taught to think about things that makes it look simple, but it's never going to be. And part of the reason for that is that we really want to move towards, and this is particularly important in engineering and design, situational and limited choice models of how we think about choice, right? That if you think of a choice as being limited, not as a bad thing, but as those limitations actually encourage you to think about all the other options that are produced, as opposed to, oh, I'm just sad that I'm limited, it tends to produce a very different kind of design work. And believe it or not, there's a whole literature in design and engineering on the fact that lots of really good designs, innovative technologies come out of trying to respond to what those limitations have been seen as before. And so limited choice models are limited in the sense where you say, what within limitations, right? I will accept or establish limitations. Within those limitations, how many different choices can I see, right? So for instance, as silly as it sounds, I'm waiting for the person to realize that while it is illegal, it is difficult, right to repair is a big issue around Teslas. If anybody actually wrote their own software, right, all of the right to repair limitations for Teslas, all the reasons why you can't have a secondhand Tesla have to do with proprietary ownership of software. You're talking about choices. I often, we're coming up on the end of class, so I'll end in a moment by saying I often like to remind people another model of choice called a Hobbs $40,000 signing bonus. But I will point out that's a small signing bonus compared to.
So just to wrap up, I want to add a little bit more focus on the concept of proportional and absolute responsibility. Sovereign choice has historically been linked to the idea of absolute responsibility. Once you make a choice, all responsibility is on you. And this is antithetical to the way that the world actually works. It just isn't that way. The nature of how decision making works, how choice works, how responsibility works, tends to be better modeled by looking at there being components or elements of responsibility from many different places. And we can find that in the functional models of responsibility and how businesses organize tasks. We can see it in how laws work. But proportional responsibility says that in any situation where you're determining or ascribing, where you're writing the responsibility onto some people, some things, some technologies, we're going to be making decisions, many decisions, about not just which one is most responsible, but that in different ways, proportionate responsibility can allow some responsibility to go with either case. And by result or by response to that, we move towards a theory of proportionate justice or proportional response to those things. So when we look at models of choice, the emphasis on action tends to make this more difficult. Rather than options, the invisibility of other options means that we're pushed to think of how that one action of choice has all the responsibility. And I use the concept that came out of a institutional psychology study years ago the idea of the unmade choices. That in fact, if we want to talk about responsibility, one of the real challenges is we may not be aware of choices we're making. We may be doing something, thinking about something, saying something, or not doing something, not thinking about something, not saying something, and that the fact that it would never occur to us is itself both a choice because we had the potential to have done that, or in some ways, more importantly, we may still have responsibility for it even if we've never thought about it. An unmade choice, therefore, is a choice, selection, or decision that was determined without intentional or reflexive action. Often it is completely outside of your attention. An unmade choice is particularly important in engineering because the use of standards, expectations, etc., means that we are often encouraged to work without reflexive decision making. And it's particularly important in engineering because those decisions, once made, become built-in features. And a classic example of this is that um, when people chose to do anti-knocking modifications to gasoline, get cars had backfires. You may see this in old movies. Cars made noise. They lost cylinder strokes, and so they added chemicals to that. One of the ironies is that for much of your life, you will have seen the term unleaded gasoline without ever realizing that the anti-knocking agent that was used for about 60 years was lead. I forget what the actual formula was. It was some variety of lead. But the thing is that they already knew lead was harmful. Um, People literally in the design process of making those choices said this is cheaper than the other chemical available, and it's not like we're feeding it to people, so we're just not worried about the health effects. And years later, there was someone else's attention to that choice that demanded that people come to terms with the fact that those designers, those engineers working on the fuel problem had made a choice without ever thinking about it to decide not to worry about health effects in the environment. And so very significant large scale things can be missed even though you are effectively making those choices. Those unmade choices are important. And when we do focus on the action of choosing as the element of choice that's important, we are actually discouraged from thinking about all those things that we can't immediately think about, all the things that we're not paying attention to. So you think you have no choice other than this, therefore you do that or you don't do it. And it becomes what can be described as a Hobson's choice, which was mentioned on a previous slide. A Hobson's choice is one where you have the pressure or a need to make a decision, and the decision only carries one option. So you're either doing something or not doing something. And very traditionally, this was a model based on the idea that um, the the guy who rented horses, the way you'd rent cars nowadays, to people, I forget, at University of Cambridge or Oxford, um, got tired of people asking for the best horse or argue about price and simply said, I'm the only person to rent horses around here. If you want a horse, you take the horse I give you at the price I give you. Your Hobson's choice is to have a horse or not have a horse. And that by reducing down to that absolutely simplified binary choice, you in fact can remove all options. And it's particularly important to recognize that even in that case, you still have options. And that the immediate visibility of one option tends to mean that people are forgetting or denying the importance of finding those other options. Um, So this is what we're going to work on over the course of the semester, is thinking about how these concepts of proportional responsibility, how we can develop a better mental model for choice, and in doing so, how we can then apply ethical theory to recognize where and how decisions are being made well, where we can make our own decisions better. All right, so in a model of proportionate choice or proportional choice, we are considering that the kinds of choices are produced by many factors, and so the options available have to be taken into account when we talk about the action that you're doing, right? When you choose this, you're not only choosing between the choices, the options that you are aware of, you're choosing between all possible options, but we're balancing that with a model of proportional or proportionate responsibility, right? If there's an educational system, if your boss or if another element in the system is pressuring you not to see that choice, if it makes it harder. And we can see that effect if we look for it. That the choice and the responsibility are both moderated, limited, or affected by what other aspects of the situation or context make them possible. And for some of you, that'll sound a little familiar because we talked about the concept of agency in relationship to socially responsible design last week. And in some ways, the premise of moving from a sovereign choice model or an absolute power model of choice, of action, of decision making, to one that looks at these complex interactions, like Renix and Robinson are arguing, is made more difficult by the way that the trolley problem teaches us to think about this situation, exclude other variables, limit the choices options, limit the kinds of things you're thinking about, make those externalities excess. When we allow those models to do that, we're making it harder for ourselves to actually have a grasp on the full issues involved. And depending on what ethical theory we're using, that could be a bigger or a smaller fundamental problem. But it is a very big problem if we're talking about selecting actions within a consequentialist approach, because, at least in theory, part of choosing an action as the beneficial action, the one that has the correct consequences, is comparative. And in almost all consequentialist theories, they are in fact discussing which of many options. It's not simply, is this decision or action good enough? The question is that decision or action as good as other possible actions, better or worse than other possible actions? And so we need to have better models, better ways to thinking about our choices, asking about what options are made more or less visible, what factors, effects, interests, or other people are shaping those things. And that's important because it gives us a better model of choice, a better model for understanding decision making and action. But it's also fundamentally important because we have these mental models or frameworks related to ethics that we're taught. And those other frameworks, those other ways to think about things, affect and change how we think about ethics. So I wanted to take just a minute, having talked about the concept of proportionate responsibility, to talk a little about other related things. Blame, fault, and to some extent, we're going to also talk about why codes of ethics are related to that, just for a minute. Now, blame, when we talk about it, is a different thing than fault. Blame is an action done by other people. And it's directed and it's punitive. It is intended to say taking responsibility, being responsible is a bad thing. And so one of the things you have to recognize is that the entire model of thinking about accusation or punitive responsibility that blame represents is a bad ethical framework. It doesn't work with most ethical systems. And in most ethical systems, the act of blaming somebody as an action is unlikely to be useful. It is not going to produce positive outcomes, and it rarely, if ever, satisfies the demands of action that duties produce. So, for instance, when we talk about a code of ethics, there's often a code of ethical demand within a professional organization that you show or present evidence that somebody else has done something wrong, that you give information responding to that. But the framework within a code of ethics isn't just saying to blame somebody. The purpose of your action that is being directed, that is being suggested or demanded, is to do something. You need to make people see that the ethical obligations are being met by the profession. You need to act to show the profession is trustworthy. It's not about blame, it's about acting in such a way that the profession is worthy of the trust that's impressed upon it. And by extension, we are going to occasionally talk about and think about fault, that is, recognizing in an accusatory way where greatest responsibility lies. And what I'd like to suggest is that while we don't blame, we will talk about cause, or in fact, often many causes, as being producing an outcome. Fault, unlike blame, is not accusatory and punitive. It is simply accusatory. And that means that you're literally saying this is that person's fault. This is that system's fault. But it doesn't, in saying that something is their fault, you're directing an observation of responsibility. And in theory, we can talk about fault in a legal framework, in an ethical framework, in a moral framework, in all sorts of different ways. When we do that in the model of blame, when we intend the accusation itself to be a punishment, then we move into that model of blame. And what we want to be able to do from an ethical standpoint is think about that action. Does it produce a positive, a beneficial outcome? Is it good for the profession? Is it required to live up to a duty? And what is the source of that duty? So, for instance, even if there's not going to be a positive outcome for anybody, there's often a requirement in professional ethics to open up and show where an error happened. And it may not immediately be obvious why that's not blaming somebody, why that is about making transparent the fault, the reason, or the cause of a problem. But in the end, the reason one does that is because A, you can learn to prevent equivalent things, and B, because transparency of cause is one of the fundamental expectations to produce trustworthiness. It's a kind of honesty that is structurally required. When we talked about structural ethics, it doesn't matter if you love it, if you hate it, but in order to be trustworthy, you have to be willing to be of the kind of trust that is expected in order to allow future trust. And so I do want to suggest that it's worth taking a little time to think about where the language of responsibility, the language of accountability can be used to move not simply as a language shift, but move away from the way of thinking, the mental model that blame has in it. And it's not necessarily impossible to talk about fault, but it may be more effective, more useful to talk about responsibility. And part of the reason for that is that it's, as a silly example, you can say it's a dog's fault when it makes a mess, right? You can say that the dog has done something wrong, but you know that even if you're blaming the dog, even if you punish the dog isn't necessarily going to fix the problem. And that means that the moment we move away from blame to talking about where and how those responsibilities interact with other responsibilities, where and how multiple things happen. If the dog wasn't left alone by the owner, if the dog was trained differently, if the dog was in a different environment, we can take a silly mental model like a dog that has made a mess, and we can start seeing whether the action of blaming, the action of recognizing fault, and the action of discussion of responsibility are the same action or different. In the case of the dog, everybody can say the dog is the one who made the mess, right? If you say that the act that is right is to blame the dog, you're making the choice not to talk about what other factors, what other components were in it, that the right action is not to think about those things, it is to punish the dog by pointing to it. If you talk about fault, you're saying, yes, the important thing here is to say the dog produced this outcome. It did this action. And there are times where you want to do that. For instance, if you're doing training of the dog and you need to be able to show the dog what it did wrong, you can use negative or positive reinforcement to try and train the dog. Your fault, here is the result. In fact, in the case of training a dog, it's very useful to be able to link an action to the cause to demonstrate that the action was bad. It produced a bad outcome. People are much more complicated than that, and we don't necessarily find that demonstrating fault is as useful an action. Instead, we'll want to look at the system that produced the outcome. If the dog made a mess because it was left alone, it may be more important as an action to keep the dog from being left alone than it is to say the dog's part, even though it has a responsibility along with all the other things in the situation that produced it. That's the thing, right? The dog can't understand the situation the same way. It doesn't have the same perspective. It doesn't have the same models. And so it's not going to be useful to blame the dog. Whereas if we look at responsibility, or in another version of the language of responsibility is accountability, where we look at accountability not in terms of what the responsibility was, but who has the greater responsibility specifically to deal with it. That's what accountability means. Not who has the greater responsibility in a model of proportional responsibility, but specifically, let's focus on the systems of accountability, that is, where and how somebody responds after the fact. And so in many cases, it's worth having these different models in mind, because if you're aware that you're selecting which model, then you're allowed or able to produce different choices. You literally have more options in a situation. If I got mad as a professor and said, it's your fault, you should have turned that homework in on time, that's true, right? To the extent that you had an obligation, you failed to meet it, therefore whatever other factors were involved, you did something wrong. But if I blame you, if I'm accusatory and punitive, it does not tend to produce greater learning. It does not tend to produce better options or results in the long term. And in the system of duties as a student, if I prioritize the duty to learn, I may be harming the likelihood that you learn by focusing on the duty to follow the instructions and the obligation to turn the homework in. And so instead of talking about blame, you shift and switch to fault. Well, let's see, what would it look like in fault? Whose fault is it? Well, partially it's your fault. You had all these other things going on, but all of a sudden, because we move from blame, who has the ultimate blame, to who has the ultimate fault, well, that's context based, that's situational, right? If your car didn't start, if this happened, if you had an exam in another class, those are what can be called mitigating factors. There are other elements within a system of proportional or distributed responsibility. So instead of looking at fault, though, we could then move to talking directly about those systems of responsibility, right? Which of those elements, right? And in each of those cases, was there another responsibility? Or your car didn't start. Well, do you know that you have an unreliable car, right? Is there a reason that you would be able to prevent that? Did you have a responsibility about the car or just about the class? Were there other responsibilities involved? Did you have this family obligation? Were you at work? What was the element that produced those things that produce multiple different responsibilities? Because again, if you have a responsibility to pass a major exam, and that's what prevents you from doing a minor homework, you're not saying those two responsibilities didn't both exist. You're saying you prioritized between them. In choosing to look at the responsibilities, you are able to act more ethically because you're beginning to see where multiple different responsibilities and systems exist.